If there's anybody with tomatoes, please leave. We're going to begin here. We said 8 o'clock, and there's so few people still eating, so just go ahead and enjoy your food. And maybe it won't be so enjoyable after we start, but then that's the way life is.
Where were you on the afternoon of December 7th, 1941? If your name is Michel Piastro, you were at Carnegie Hall tightening the strings of your violin for the Sunday afternoon performance. If you were at WWII, you were addressing 2,200 American firsters in Pittsburgh. If your name is Saburo Caruso, you were waiting in the outer office of Cordell Hull. If you were a sailor named Thomas at a place called Pearl Harbor, you and 2,116 of your buddies will be dead when the day is done.
In the dark days of 1941, the high white cliffs of Dover on the English Channel coast were guideposts for the German planes that flew in a seemingly endless string to bomb London and other inland targets. Two American songwriters, Nat Burton and Walter Kent, looked ahead to better days when the bombers would be replaced by bluebirds, and created one of the most touching songs to come out of World War II.
Pearl Harbor was not the only place bombed that weekend. The list was long. Burma, Dutch East Indies, Guam, Hong Kong, Midway, Malaya, Singapore, Shanghai, the Philippines, Wake Island. And within the next 2 weeks, all of these places, plus Thailand and Attu and Kiska in the Alaskan Aleutians, would be invaded, or at least attempted to be invaded. On December 8th, when President Roosevelt went before Congress to ask for a declaration of war, he called this the day that would live in infamy. When he asked for the declaration of war, the Senate voted unanimously to declare war. The House voted 388 to 1. Within 3 days, Germany and Italy would declare war on the United States. The United States would declare war on Germany and Italy, and Great Britain would declare war on Japan. Christmas of 1941 was probably the blackest holiday since civilization began. 4/5, 80% of the people on Earth were involved in World War II. Recruiting offices were jammed with young men wanting to fight the Japanese, even if they had to go off and leave their sweethearts.
When Bam Steps wrote a tune called Anywhere the Bluebird Goes in 1939. Lou Brown and Charlie Spieth later wrote lyrics for the melody, and Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree was introduced. The song became a bestseller after the Andrews sisters sang it in the movie Private Buckaroo. For the departing GIs, it was an appeal to their girls at home to be faithful.
Don't sit under the apple tree with anyone else but me. Anyone else but me. Anyone else but me. No, no, no. Whether I've been true to nobody else but you. So just be true to me.
Don't go walking down Lover's Lane with anyone else but me. Anyone else but me. Anyone else but me. No, no, no. Don't start showing off all your charms to somebody else's arms. You must be true to me. I'm so afraid that the plans we made underneath those moonlit skies will fade away and you're bound to stray. If the stars get in your eyes, oh, don't stay under the apple tree with anyone else but me. You're my L.O.V.E.
In the early days of 1942, Japan continued their winning way. General MacArthur was forced out onto the Bataan Peninsula in January. By April, he was ordered to Corregidor, then on to Mindanao, and finally to Australia, where he would be named Supreme Commander of the war effort in the South Pacific. He left General Wainwright in charge of the Philippine defense. These are the days from the I shall return speech. Submarines attacked tankers off the East Coast, and oil refineries in California were shelled. There were blackouts on both coasts and in all the large cities. Manufacturing plants went from peacetime production to wartime production. Tanks instead of cars. Airplane components instead of radios. Men, and many women, went into the military. The war production was left in the hands of housewives who had probably never held a screwdriver. Children collected aluminum foil, milkweed pods, and rubber. There was scrap metal drive. Foundries worked overtime. Synthetic rubber experimentation began. And in the spring, we planted victory gardens. We had meatless days and wheatless days, and this helped to give the civilians a stake in the war effort, as well as being a valuable thing to the war effort. They could experience feelings of support and confidence, and be a part of the unity with the troops.
The line, play it again, Chanel, never failed to conjure up the scene in Casablanca in which Humphrey Bogart, drunk and despondent in his deserted cafe, listens as Julie Wilson plays and croons the memory-evoking strains of Herman Huffield as time goes by.
You must remember this until this will again. The song is yours to and when two lovers go, they still say I love you. I'm glad you carry on. No matter what the future brings, as time goes on. So my and all, never out of date, heart full of passion.
were required to register, and by February, 100,000 Japanese Americans would be interned in camps around the United States. An Allied fleet was battered and nearly destroyed in the Java Sea. Things were very black, but we did get a psychological boost when Jimmy Doolittle and his group, flying from the aircraft carriers, bombed Tokyo. Japanese Fleet Admiral Yamamoto had expressed concern that there were no aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor. Corregidor fell, and General Wainwright and the gallant defenders of the Philippines went on the long Bataan Death March to the prison camp. During the summer, the Allies began to gain strength. By then, Japan was in charge of 10% of the Earth's surface. U-boats were sinking ships in the Atlantic. In one 10-month period, 500 ships with valuable materials went to the bottom of the ocean. Then destroyers began protecting these convoys, and things changed. In North Africa, Rommel, the Desert Fox, drove across the northern part of the Africa, heading for the Suez Canal to obstruct shipping and to link up with the Japanese. He got to Al Alamein, Egypt, 60 miles from Suez. And the Germans were driving across Russia. Behind them, the old people, the women, and the children were practicing the guerrilla warfare, and ahead of them, the Russians were practicing a scorched earth policy, burning and blowing up anything the Germans could use. And at home, gasoline and tires, coffee and sugar were rationed. 18-year-olds were being drafted. And to bolster our spirits, we were singing Rosie the Riveter, This is the Army, Mr. Brown, and Heil, Heil, right in der Führer's face.
When the Führer says he is the master race, he Heil, Heil, and in the Führer's face, not to love the Führer is a great disgrace, so we Heil, Heil, and in the Führer's face. When the Goebbels says he owns the world's face, he Heil, Heil, and in the Goebbels' face. When the Goering says he'll never bomb this place, he Heil, Heil, and in the Goering's face. I be not the Superman, and if you're a Superman. Yeah, he is the Superman. Super Superman. Is this Nazi land so good? Would you leave it if you could? Yeah, this Nazi land is good. Leave it if we could. We bring the world to order. I'll take this world to order. If we want a foreign race, we love the Führer's face. When we bring to the world disorder. When the Führer says he is the master race, Heil, and in the Führer's face, not to love the Führer is a great disgrace, so we Heil, and in the Führer's face. Führer says he is the master. And in the Führer's face, not to love the Führer is a great disgrace, so we Heil, Heil, right in the Führer's face.
By May of 1942, the Allies won the Battle of the Coral Sea because they had broken the Japanese coast, and Australia was saved from invasion. In August, we countered with our first offensive when the Marines launched an amphibious attack against Guadalcanal. It would be early 1943 before it was taken, but at least we were on the attack. There were three major turning points in the war in 1943 during the last half. The first one was when the Allies won a defensive victory when the Japanese tried to invade Midway. This was mostly done with aircraft, carriers, and planes. The second one was at El Alamein, when the Allies yielded to a Rommel blitzkrieg, allowed the tanks to penetrate the lines, then closed the gap and left 300 German tanks burning in the desert. Mr. Churchill said, before Alamein we could win nothing. After Alamein we could lose nothing. In December, the third turning point came when the beleaguered Russians sent out pincer movements from Stalingrad and struck at the German army. What was left of the German army began the long, cold, torturous trip back to Germany.
Say a Prayer for the Boys Over There was created by Herb Matchison and Jimmy McHugh in 1943. The song was introduced by Deanna Durbin in the motion picture Hers to Hold, and was also presented by McHugh in England at a command performance for Queen Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh.
The tide began to turn early in 1943. Roosevelt and Churchill met at Casablanca and decided that only unconditional surrender would do for this war. Eisenhower invaded Sicily. The Italian resistance crumbled when Mussolini was taken from power by his people. The Germans, however, continued resistance in Italy. The Allies continued to take back islands in the South Pacific: Bougainville, the Gilberts, New Britain, New Guinea, Tinian, Tarawa. On the home front, people were buying war bonds. There was full employment, full production. Child labor laws were reduced so that 14-year-olds could work in the factories. Shoes, meats, fat, and cheese were rationed. Wages, salaries, and prices in some cases were frozen to control inflation. For the first time, Americans began to have income tax taken out of their paychecks because they were making more money than they ever had. In November of 1943, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met at Tehran, the first time the Big Three would be all together. They'd planned the invasion for the coming year, and we were listening to sentimental love songs.
Can you believe that a song which made 24 appearances on the hit parade in 1944, 10 times in the #1 spot, was once a failure? The combined effort of Irving Cahill and Sandy Fink produced the song I'll Be Seeing You in 1938. Their song was part of the musical Right This Way, which flopped. The song lay forgotten for 5 years. Thanks to performers like Frank Sinatra, I'll Be Seeing You was revived in 1943 and became one of the most successful ballads of World War II.
Opened with the United States and the other allies making vigorous strides forward, particularly in the South Pacific, where Admiral Nimitz was sweeping through there from his bases in the Marshall Islands. Superfortresses were bombing Japan from bases in China. The Marines took Saipan, and civilians and troops alike jumped from high cliffs to avoid the Americans because they had been told they were so sadistic that it caused them to commit suicide. In Europe, the Allies invaded western Italy at Anzio and Monte Cassino. American planes could now bomb German factories from many bases. And then on June 6th, the long-awaited invasion of France. And we had words like D-Day, D-Day +1, Utah Beach, Omaha Beach, Cherbourg, Normandy, mulberries entered our vocabulary. The Germans fought back with buzz bombs and doodlebugs and V-2 rockets, which landed on England for several months, but made little difference in the war. On August 2nd, another invasion of France came up the Rhone Valley, and Paris was retaken. In September, the Allies crossed into Germany, and the Russians came in from the west. Allied planes were still clashing with the Luftwaffe in spectacular air battles.
Sonny Gregg was an Air Force pilot and former football star. He told Jimmy McHugh of a close call he had as an Air Force pilot when he was on a mission to North Africa, and we came in on one engine and a prayer. In 1943, McHugh composed the music, Harold Adamson the words, and the song Coming In on a Wing and a Prayer was introduced by Eddie Cantor at an Air Force base. It became popular during World War II with a sheet music sale in excess of 1 million copies.
One of our planes was missing, 2 hours overdue. One of our planes was missing, with all its gallant crew. The radio sets were humming, they waited for a word. Then a voice broke through the
and I always sing as we live through the air. Look below, there's our field over there, with our full crew aboard and our trust in the Lord, coming in on a wing and a prayer.
I left out a good line for the invasion. I was supposed to mention that there were 2 million troops, 4,000 ships, and 11,000 planes, the largest invasion force in history. In October of 1944, MacArthur waded ashore in the Philippines and embraced an emaciated and ill General Wainwright. He had kept his promise to return. At home, much of the meat rationing ended. The GI Bill was passed by Congress, giving veterans priorities in both housing and education. Factories began to make things like vacuum cleaners, and refrigerators, and phonographs, and civilian radios. And in November, Franklin Roosevelt was elected for an unprecedented fourth term. In December, the Germans launched a last gasp of tremendous proportions. They broke through the American lines in the forested Ardennes region and drove through until they cut off much of the many of the Allied places. This was the Battle of the Bulge. At Bastogne, General McAuliffe, who was the defender of Bastogne, received 2 German officers under white flags. When they asked for his surrender, he replied, "Nuts," surprising the German officers because they didn't know what he meant. After much bloodshed on both sides, Patton's tanks, Montgomery's forces, and the Allied air power took over, and the Battle of the Bulge was over. And the Allies started back for Berlin.
Duke Ellington's Don't Get Around Much Anymore was derived from his instrumental composition Never No Laments in 1942. Bob Russell added the lyrics, and the Duke with his orchestra included the song in an RCA Victor recording. However, it became popular mainly through Jimmy Savo's burlesque treatment in vaudeville and nightclubs.
When I'm not playing solitaire, I take a look down from the shelf and watch with programs on the air. I see rainbows through myself. In the Saturday night, when they crawl in the floor, living merry without you, don't get around much anymore. All I did with the floor, got as far as the door. Baby, ask me about you, don't get around much anymore. Darling, I guess my mind's already, but never known. Why stir up memories divided on days? Might have gone with what's for, awfully different without you. Don't get around much anymore. Darling, I guess my mind's already, but nevertheless, why stir up memories divided on days? Might have gone with what's more, awfully different without you. Don't get around much anymore.
(1945), the year the war would end. It began with the Americans over Berlin and with the American Marines in full-scale invasion in the Philippines. And we heard another new word, kamikaze pilot, as the Japanese fought back with a last gasp. The big three met at Yalta in February. They decided how they were going to partition Germany and about the adoption of the UN. In the pictures, Roosevelt appears old and sick. Much of what happened at Yalta influenced what would happen later. It made it possible for the Russians to annex the Eastern Bloc countries and for the Iron Curtain. In March, the Marines headed for Okinawa, but to get there they had to go through Iwo Jima, and it is from that battle that we get the wonderful picture of the 6th Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi. 2 weeks later, Okinawa was invaded. That was the second largest invasion force in history, and this was the bloodiest battle of the South Pacific. It would take 2.5 months before it would fall, and that would be the last battle of the South Pacific.
Do you remember Betty Davis in the motion picture musical Thank Your Lucky Stars, 1943? She expressed the lament of the World War II females at the home front in the Frank Lesser Arthur Schwartz song, They're Either Too Young or Too Old.
I looked the field over and lo and behold,
In April, Franklin Roosevelt suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage at his home in Georgia and died, leaving Harry Truman the job of finishing the war and handling the peace. 2 weeks later, Mussolini was executed by his countrymen. And on the 1st of May, Hitler committed suicide. 3 leaders gone in less than 3 weeks. On May 7th, the Germans surrendered, and General Eisenhower took that surrender at his headquarters at a schoolhouse in Reims, France. In August, the Enola Gay flew over Hiroshima and dropped the atomic bomb. 3 days later, Nagasaki suffered the same fate. At this, the Japanese hierarchy decided to surrender. General MacArthur accepted that surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay.
One of the most successful ballads of World War II was written in 1944 by Sammy Kahn with music by Jules Stein. Dinah Shore sang it in the motion picture musical Follow the Boys, and Frank Sinatra recorded it for Capitol Records. This is the only song by Kahn to sell over 1 million copies of sheet music. The title of this bestseller is I'll Walk Alone.
I walk alone because to tell you the truth, I don't find me lonely when my heart tells me you are only two. I walk alone and ask me why I'll tell them I'd rather. There are dreams I'll gather. Dreams we fashioned the night you held me tight. I'll always be near you wherever you are. Please shine in every breath. If you call, I'll hear you. No matter how far, just close your eyes and I'll be there. We walk alone, pretend you're not and your kisses guide me. Till you're walking by me, I'll walk alone.
And so the war was over, except for the Nuremberg trials, the rebuilding of Europe and South, the Pacific and North Africa, the bringing home of the troops, the grieving for those who would not be coming home, the veterans who came home to begin the long ordeal of healing. We reconverted the American factories to peacetime. You could get on a list to get a new car. We were at the beginning of the baby boom. Korea was divided along the 38th parallel, and we know what that led to. In the fall elections, Churchill was elected out of office. One World War II song began, When the Lights Come On Again, all over the world. And for us, that seemed to be the time when the lights were coming on again all over the world.
The first major disc success by both Doris Day and Les Brown and his orchestra came in 1945 with the song Sentimental Journey. Words and music are by Bud Green, Les Brown, and Ben Homer. Perhaps you saw the motion picture starring John Payne and Maureen O'Hara. It was adopted by Les Brown as his theme song.
Take a sentimental journey, gonna set my heart at ease. Gonna take a sentimental journey to renew old memories. Got my bag, I got my reservation. Any time I could afford.
7 p.m. Eastern Wartime. Bob Trout reporting. The Japanese have accepted our terms fully. That's the word we've just received from the White House in Washington. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of the Second World War. The United Nations, on land, on the sea, in the air, and to the four corners of the earth, are united and are victorious.
The servicemen and women returned home triumphantly to parade and salute and went on to their homes greeted by their loved ones, where life again seems like old times.
Seems like old times, having you to walk with. Seems like old times, having you to talk with, and it's still a thrill just to have my arms around you. Still a thrill that it was the day I found you. Seems like old times, bitter days and flowers just like old times. Staying up for hours, making dreams come true, doing things we used to do. Seems like old times, being here with you. Seems like old times, having you to walk with. Seems like old times, having you to talk with, and it's still a thrill just to have my arms around you. Still a thrill that it was the day I found you. Seems like old times, bitter days and flowers just like old times. Staying up for hours, making dreams come true, doing things we used to do. Seems like old times, being here with you.
Irving Berlin originally wrote the words and music to God Bless America for an all-soldiers show in 1918. He changed his mind and packed the song away. When Kate Smith asked Berlin for a special number for her radio show on Armistice Day, he knew this song would express his own pride in and love of this country. Kate Smith introduced the number on her radio program on November 10, 1938, the last peacetime armistice celebrated in the U.S. before World War II.
God bless America, and our God, stand beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above.
here, so if any of you in the back room would like to join us, there's someone at the door frisking anyone that comes through, and I see somebody that got through the frisk already. I happen to know there's one tomato in the house right now. So if, uh-oh, there it is. I hope she has lousy aim, that's all I can say. So if there's anybody else that wants to join us, why, we're just about ready to go.
1941.
That's what I said. Well, we got
It still is. Come on. It's a while since it came down. March? April?
Violin for the Sunday afternoon performance. If you are Gerald Nye, you are addressing 2,200 America Firsters in Pittsburgh. If your name is Saburo Caruso, you are waiting in the outer office of Cordell Hull. If you are a sailor named Thomas at a place called Pearl Harbor, you and 2,116 of your buddies will be dead when the day is done.
In the dark days of 1941, the high white cliffs of Dover on the English Channel were guideposts for the German planes that flew in a seemingly endless stream to bomb London and other inland targets. Two American songwriters, Nat Burton and Walter Kent, looked ahead to better days, when the bombers would be replaced by bluebirds, and created one of the most touching songs to come out of World War II.
On December 7th, 1941, when Pearl Harbor was bombed, it was not the only target hit that weekend. Long list: Burma, Dutch East Indies, Guam, Hong Kong, Malaya, Midway, Shanghai, Singapore, Wake Island. Within the next 2 weeks, all of these would be either attempted to be invaded or be invaded. And also Thailand and two islands in the Aleutians, the Alaskan Aleutians, Attu and Kiska, would be invaded. On December 8th, when Roosevelt went before the Congress to ask for a declaration of war, he called this a day that would live in infamy. He got his declaration of war unanimously in the Senate, 388 to 1 in the House. By December 11th, Great Britain would have declared war on Japan. Germany and Italy would have declared war on the United States, and the United States would have declared war on Germany and Italy. The Christmas of 1941 was probably the blackest holiday since civilization had begun. 4/5, 80% of the people on Earth were involved in World War II. Recruitment offices were jammed with young men wanting to fight the Japanese, even if they had to leave their sweethearts behind.
Sam Stett wrote a tune called Anywhere the Bluebird Goes in 1939. Lou Brown and Charlie Tobias later wrote lyrics for the melody, and Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree was introduced. The song became a bestseller after the Andrews sisters sang it in the movie Private Buckaroo. For the departing GIs, it was an appeal to their girls at home to be faithful.
Don't sit under the apple tree with anyone else but me. Anyone else but me. Anyone else but me. No, no, no. Remember that I've been through nobody else but you. So just be true to me.
Don't go walking down Lover's Lane with anyone else but me. Anyone else but me. Anyone else but me. No, no, no. Don't start showing off all your charms in somebody else's arms. You must be true to me. I'm so afraid that the pleasure we feel underneath those moonlit skies will fade away and you're on to stray. If the stars in your eyes, so don't sit under the apple tree with anyone else but me. You're my L.O.V.E.
In the early days of 1942, Japan continued winning. General Douglas MacArthur was forced out onto the Bataan Peninsula with his defenders of the Philippines. Then he was ordered to Corregidor, on to Mindanao, and finally to Australia, where he would become the supreme commander of the war effort in the South Pacific. These are the black days when he made his I shall return speech. General Wainwright was left in charge of the defense of the Philippine Islands. Submarines were attacking ships off the East Coast, and oil refineries were shelled in California. We had blackouts on both coasts in some of the large cities. The manufacturing plants geared up from peacetime manufacturing to wartime manufacturing. Tanks instead of cars, airplane components instead of radios. Men, and some women, went into the military, and the wartime production was left in the hands of housewives, many of whom had never held a screwdriver. Children gathered aluminum foil, rubber, and milkweed pods to help the war effort. There were scrap metal drives. Foundries worked overtime. Synthetic rubber experimentation was begun. And in the spring, we planted victory gardens. We had meatless and wheatless days. This was a value to the war effort, but it also gave the citizens a stake in the war, a feeling of unity, confidence, and support for the troops.
The line "Play Again, Sam" never failed to conjure up the scene in Casablanca in which Humphrey Bogart, drunk and despondent in his deserted cafe, listens as Julie Wilson plays and croons the memory-evoking strains of As Time Goes By.
You must remember this. A kiss is still a kiss. And by is just goodbye. They still say I love
required to register. And by February, 100,000 Japanese Americans were interned in camps throughout the United States. An Allied fleet was battered and nearly destroyed in the Java Sea. The days were black. But then we got a psychological boost when Jimmy Doolittle and his crew, flying from the deck of aircraft carriers, bombed Tokyo. Fleet Admiral Yamamoto had expressed concern when he found there were no aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor. Corregidor fell, and General Wainwright and his valiant defenders began the long march across the Bataan to the prison camp, the Bataan Death March. During the summer, the Allies began to gain strength. By then, the Japanese controlled 1/10 of the Earth's surface. U-boats were sinking our ships. In one 10-month period, they sunk 500 with all the valuable materials to the bottom of the ocean. And then destroyers began protecting those huge convoys, and things got better. In North Africa, Rommel, the Desert Fox, was driving across toward the Suez Canal, hoping to link up with the Japanese and to bother our shipping. He got as far as El Alamein, 60 miles from the Suez Canal. And the Germans were driving across Russia, while the Russians practiced a scorched earth policy, burning and blowing up everything the Germans could use. And behind the lines, old people, women, and children practiced guerrilla warfare. And at home, gasoline, tires, coffee, sugar were being rationed. 18-year-olds were being drafted. And to bolster our spirits, we were singing songs like Rosie the Riveter, This is the Army, Mr. Brown, and Heil, Heil, right into Führer's face. In May, the Allies won the Battle of the Coral Sea, mainly because we had broken the Japanese code, and Australia was saved from invasion. In August, we countered with our very first offensive. The Marines launched an amphibious attack against Guadalcanal. It would not be taken until 1943, but at least we were on the attack. There were three major turning points in the last half of 1942. The first was when the Allies won a defensive battle to protect Midway. This was mostly airplanes off aircraft carriers. The second was at El Alamein. The Allies yielded to Rommel's blitzkrieg, allowed his tanks to penetrate, then closed the gap and left 300 German tanks burning in the desert. And as Mr. Churchill said about that, before Alamein we could win nothing. After Alamein we could lose nothing. And the third turning point was in December when the beleaguered Russians in Stalingrad launched a pincer movement against the German army. What was left of the German army began the long, cold, torturous retreat back to Germany.
Say a Prayer for the Boys Over There was created by Herb Magidson and Jimmy McHugh in 1943. The song was introduced by Deanna Durbin in the motion picture Courage to Hold, and was also presented by McHugh in England as a command performance for Queen Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh.
More than ever in early 1943. Roosevelt and Churchill met at Casablanca and decided that only unconditional surrender would do for the war. Eisenhower invaded Sicily. The Italian resistance crumbled when Mussolini was removed from power, but the German resistance in Italy went on. The Allies continued taking back islands in the South Pacific. There were many bloody battles at Bougainville, the Gilberts, New Britain, New Guinea, Tinian, and Tarawa. The home folks were buying war bonds. There was full employment and full production. Child labor laws were relaxed so that children as young as 14 could work in the factories. Shoes, meat, fat, and cheese was added to the list of ration goods. Wages, salaries, and prices were frozen in many cases frozen to do away with inflation. For the first time, many Americans had income tax removed from their salaries because for the first time Americans were making enough money for that. In November of 1943, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met at Tehran, the first time the big three would be together. And at this they planned the European invasion for the next year. And we were listening to sentimental love songs.
Can you believe that a song which made 24 appearances on the hit parade in 1944, 10 times in the #1 spot, was once a failure? The combined effort of Irving Cahill and Sammy Fain produced the song, I'll Be Seeing You, in 1938. Their song was part of the musical Right This Way, which flopped. The song lay forgotten for 5 years. Thanks to performers like Frank Sinatra, I'll Be Seeing You was revived in 1943 and became one of the most successful ballads of World War II.
I'll be seeing you in all the old familiar places that this heart of mine embraces all day through. In a small cafe, afar, along the way, the children's carousel, the chestnut tree, the wishing well. I'll be seeing you in every lovely summer's day, in everything that's bright and gay. I'll always think of you that way. I'll find you in the morning sun, and when the night is new, I'll be looking at the moon, but I'll be seeing you.
1944 opened with vigorous strides forward as Admiral Nimitz swept across the South Pacific from his bases in the Marshall Islands. Superfortresses were bombing Japan from bases in China. When our Marines invaded Saipan, Japanese troops and civilians committed suicide by jumping off high cliffs. They had been told how sadistic American troops were. In Europe, the Allies invaded Western Italy, and we had the battles at Anzio and Monte Cassino. American planes could now bomb German factories from many bases. And then on June 6th, the long-awaited invasion of France, the largest invasion force ever. 2 million troops, 4,000 ships, 11,000 planes. And we learned words like D-Day, D-Day +1, Omaha Beach, Utah Beach, Mulberry, Cherbourg, Normandy. The Germans fought back with buzz bombs and doodlebugs and V-2 rockets. These fell on England for a long time, but nothing changed the war. On August 2nd, we invaded France up the Rhone Valley, and Paris was retaken. In September, the Allies crossed into Germany, with the Russians coming in from the west. And Allied planes continued to clash with the Luftwaffe in spectacular air battles.
Sonny Gregg was an Air Force pilot and former football star. He told Jimmy McHugh of a close call he had as an Air Force pilot when he was on a mission to North Africa, and we came in on one engine and a sprayer. In 1943, McHugh composed the music, Harold Adams sung the words, and the song Coming In on a Wing and a Prayer was introduced by Eddie Cantor at an Air Force base. It became popular during World War II with a sheet music sale in excess of 1 million copies.
1944, General MacArthur waded ashore in the Philippines and embraced an emaciated and ill General Wainwright. He had kept his promise to return. At home, much of the meat rationing ended. Congress passed the GI Bill, which gave priorities to veterans in housing and educational things. Factories began to make such things as vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, phonographs, and civilian radios. In November, Franklin Roosevelt was elected to an unprecedented fourth term. And in December, the Germans managed a last gasp of tremendous proportions, the Battle of the Bulge. They hit the American lines in the forested Ardennes area and broke through, cutting off Allied territory. At Bastogne, General McAuliffe, the defender of Bastogne, received 2 German officers under a white flag, and when they asked for his surrender, he replied, "Nuts," which surprised the German officers because they didn't know what he meant. After much bloodshed on both sides, Patton's tanks, Montgomery's forces, and the Allied air power relieved Bastogne. The Battle of the Bulge was over, and in the end of December, the troops moved on towards Berlin.
Duke Ellington's Don't Get Around Much Anymore was derived from the instrumental composition Never No Lament in 1942. Bob Russell added the lyrics, and the Duke with his orchestra included the song in an RCA Victor recording. However, it became popular mainly through Jimmy Savo's burlesque treatment in vaudeville and nightclubs.
The year the war would end. It began with American bombers over Berlin, and in the South Pacific, the Marines in full-scale attack. We heard a new word, kamikaze pilots, as the Japanese fought back with a last-gasp attempt. The Big Three met at Yalta in February. This was when they decided how to petition Germany and to adopt the UN. In the pictures of this, Roosevelt looks old and tired and sick. Much of what happened at Yalta would affect our years ahead. The Russians' annexation of the Eastern Bloc countries and the Iron Curtain all came from Yalta. In March, the Marines headed for Okinawa. But to get to Okinawa, they had to go through Iwo Jima. And it is from this battle that we get the wonderful picture of the 6 Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi. 2 weeks later, they invaded Okinawa with the second largest invasion force ever. The bloodiest battle of the South Pacific had begun. It would last for 2.5 months, but when it was over, it was the last battle of the South Pacific.
Do you remember Betty Davis in the motion picture musical Thank Your Lucky Stars, 1943? She expressed the lament of the World War II females at the home front in the Frank Lesser Arthur Sport song, They're Either Too Young or Too Old.
On April 12th, Franklin Roosevelt suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage in his home in Georgia and died, leaving Harry Truman with the terrible job of ending the war and handling the peace. 2 weeks later, Mussolini was executed by his countrymen, and on the 1st of May, Hitler committed suicide. 3 of the war's leaders gone in less than 3 weeks. On May 7th, the Germans surrendered to General Eisenhower at his headquarters, a small schoolhouse near Reims, France. And in August, the Enola Gay flew over Hiroshima and dropped an atomic bomb. 3 days later, Nagasaki suffered the same fate. And then the Japanese hierarchy decided to surrender. MacArthur accepted that surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay.
One of the most successful ballads of World War II was written in 1944 by Sammy Cahn with music by Jewel Stein. Dinah Shore sang it in the motion picture musical Follow the Boys, and Frank Sinatra recorded it for Capitol Records. This is the only song by Cahn to sell over 1 million copies with sheet music. The title of this bestseller is I'll Walk Alone.
I walk alone because to tell you the truth, I'm lonely. I don't like being lonely when my heart tells me you are lonely too. I walk alone. You ask me why, and I'll tell you I'd rather. There are dreams I must gather.
And so the war was over, except for the Nuremberg trials, the rebuilding of Europe, North Africa, and South Pacific, the bringing home of the troops, the grieving for those that would not be coming home, the wounded veterans who had to come home and begin the long period of healing, the reconversion in the American factories, peacetime. You could get on the list to buy a new car. That was the beginning of the baby boom, and Korea was divided on the 38th parallel. We know what that led to. In the fall elections, Churchill was voted out of office. One World War II song began with these words, "When the lights come on again all over the world." And for us, it seems that that's what the times were, lights coming on again all over the world.
The first major disc success by both Doris Day and Les Brown and his orchestra came in 1945 with the song Sentimental Journey. Words and music are by Bud Green, Les Brown, and Beth Homer. Perhaps you saw the motion picture starring John Payne and Maureen O'Hara. It was adopted by Les Brown as his theme song.
Gonna take a sentimental journey. Gonna set my heart at ease. Gonna make a sentimental journey to renew old memories. Got my bag, I got my reservation. Any time I could afford. Like a child in my anticipation. Long to hear that all aboard. Well, that's the time we leave at 7. I'll be waiting up for heaven. Counting every mile of railroad track that takes me back. Never was the heart that keeps a yearning. Why I decide to go. Gotta take the sentimental journey. Sentimental journey home. That's the time we leave at 7. I'll be waiting out for heaven. Counting every mile of railroad track that takes me back. Every thought my heart can keep a yearning. Why did I decide to go? Gotta take the sentimental journey. Sentimental journey home.
p.m. Eastern Wartime. Bob Trout reporting. The Japanese have accepted our terms
Truly, that's the word we have just received from the White House in Washington. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of the Second World War. The United Nations, on land, on the sea, in the air, and to the four quarters of the earth, are united and are victorious.
The servicemen and women returned home triumphantly to parade and salute, and went on to their homes greeted by their loved ones, where life again seemed like old times.
Seems like old times, having you to walk with. Seems like old times, having you to talk with. And it's still a thrill just to have my arms around you. Still a thrill when it was the day I found you. Seems like old times, dear days and flowers, just like old times. Staying up for hours, making dreams come true. Doing things we used to do. Seems like old times, being here with you. Seems like old times, having you to walk with. Seems like old times, having you to talk with. And it's still a thrill just to have my arms around you. Still a thrill that was the day I found you. Seems like old times, dear days and flowers, just like old times. Staying up for hours, making dreams come true. Doing things we used to do. Seems like old times, being here with you.
Irving Berlin originally wrote the words and music to God Bless America for an all-soldiers show in 1918. He changed his mind and packed the song away. When Kate Smith asked Berlin for a special number for her radio show on Armistice Day, he knew this song would express his own pride in and love of this country. Kate Smith introduced the number on her radio program on November 10, 1938, the last peacetime armistice celebrated in the U.S. before World War II. Please join singing with us the second time that we sing the song, please.
About some of these people here before you leave us. A couple of us got together and decided we'd like to try this. We found the music, picked out the songs. And luckily, we found a few more volunteers, and this is a great bunch. We've had 3 practices, is all we've done. And we have one almost a complete family here. Sarah Strong and Marilena Suter and Joe Ogle and Joe's wife Sarah are all the same family. Sarah, excuse me. I knew I screwed up. And I think you've heard Carol Kasumas. Carol did an excellent job of researching the songs, and we're really happy to have her. And Sue McDonough, Susie from a very musical family. She has 3 sisters, and they all just do a beautiful job. In fact, we'd had Boogie Woogie Doo Boy, and we could have rounded up her 3 sisters. And Francis Beekover, the only swappy in the bunch, but we let a sailor in. I don't know. And Ava Swanger was a last-minute recruit. We had one that couldn't make it, so she's only had 1 practice, but she's doing a great job. Yeah, well, that's right. We got a semi-Navy person there, or half Navy. Ron Sapi in the middle there, get him. Is a barber shopper and is really a good singer. We're really happy to have him with us too. Dean Kittleson, he sings in a Norwegian singing group in Decorah, so we recruited him. I think most of you know Ben Husberger, but we had to get him. I'm getting oh yeah, I was going to say, we had a Layman Sunday in church a few weeks ago, and Doris Martin gave a service. And while it was going on, she did such a beautiful job, I thought, we've just got to get her into this thing some way. So as soon as church was over, I went to Doris and I said, would you do a history of World War II for us and read it between each side? And you heard what that was. And we made a mistake by picking Sarah, because when we were thought we were just going to stand up here and sing songs, you know. And God, the other night she comes with all this layout with numbers on the floor, and you think we were on television. Wow, it worked out great, I think. It made it a little less monotonous at any rate. The most understanding one of the whole bunch is my wife. She has to put up with me and my dumb ideas. But it really has been a lot of fun. I hope you've enjoyed it. And to her, thanks for not throwing the tomato.
Before you go, I'd like to have you all get close enough together.
Oh, okay. That's fine. Yeah. Well, thanks again.